All right, well, good morning. We are glad and thankful and grateful to be here once again. Glad to see so many of you out here with us this morning. Just a quick note before I forget to mention concerning our Sunday evening studies that we began a couple weeks ago in doing a chronological overview of Paul's epistles. Last week, I told you that we would be looking at Galatians, but I went back and I looked at some of my study and source material, and I may not have been entirely correct on my chronology. So this evening, instead, we will be doing a survey of 1 Corinthians. So if you've already read Galatians, that's great. You'll just be ready for when we get to it. But we will be looking this evening at 1 Corinthians. But go ahead and be turning with me to Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5 and verses 25 through 34. That will serve as our text for our study this morning. And this lesson was born out of the study we've been doing in our Monday morning class for the last few weeks, and we've been privileged to be able to look at some of the accounts recorded in Mark. And now I will tell you there are a couple of parallel accounts to this as well. Matthew chapter 9 and Luke chapter 8. You can go there and you can read and study those accounts. But the main thing as we look at this that I want us to remember, especially as we study the miracles, is that each and every miracle in some way points to and involves faith in Jesus. And that is something that we do not need to lose sight of. Remember what we're told in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, is that these things are written that you may believe. And that's exactly what I want to help us to do here in our study this morning. So we need to understand that, and I want us to be able to see that the cleansing of Jesus is complete and total. So when we come to Mark chapter 5, this entire text is the recording of miracles, and it really begins in verse 21, because there we're introduced to Jairus, and of course that is recorded in Luke as well. And so when Jesus is en route to his home to cleanse or to heal his daughter, we have this account that is recorded beginning at verse 25. And so it's an interesting account because in the midst of all of this, we have this bit of detail recorded. So we begin in verse 25, and I want us to notice, first of all, the problem that this woman had. Beginning of verse 25, Mark tells us, "Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years. Now, he does not go into any great detail as to what that would be specifically. However, I will give you a cross-reference to where you can go and study, and I would direct you back to Leviticus chapter 15 if you want to go and to study and maybe get some more idea of what this may have been in a little bit more detail. So I give you that. But the problem was that this had made her unclean. Again, you go back to Leviticus chapter 15 and you'll see there all of the detail that is revealed concerning these things. And so because of that, this would have undoubtedly led to her being isolated and I would dare say in some cases maybe even ostracized by some in her time. And we need to understand that this was not a problem of her own making. No one if they can keep from it, is going to choose to have a physical malady. I know there are some of our own number that are struggling with various health concerns, and I'm sure that if each and every one of you had a preference, you would prefer not to have to deal with those things. So we need to understand that sometimes things just happen through no fault of our own. Not always, but oftentimes it's not of our own choosing. But not only had this made her unclean, but also this was a prolonged problem. We are told that she had been dealing with this for 12 years. Now, we are not told her age, so we're not going to get into all of that, but it doesn't matter because this was an ongoing problem. And no doubt this would have brought her a lot of pain, not only physically, but probably also emotionally and probably spiritually as well. Because again, you think about the isolation that would have come with that and all the other issues. So we come to verse 26, and we see here a solution. And had suffered many things from physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. And I wish I could say that that was an anomaly, and I wish I could say that that was something that we don't have to deal with today. Now, I know, again, this is not always the case, but you know as well as I do, either you have been subject to this or someone close to us has been. They have an ailment, take your pick of what it may be, and it doesn't seem to matter what they do. It doesn't seem to matter how many tests are run or how many medications are prescribed or whatever else it might be, and they never seem to get any better. That was the same problem that this poor lady had. It had indebted her. She spent all that she had. She had sought treatments that had over time proven to be ineffective. Those who were supposed to have been able to have cleansed and cured were unable to do so. And as a result, her suffering continued. So when we think about these statements here in verses 25 and 26, how does this apply to us? When we look at the world around us and when we look at people that we know maybe rather intimately or maybe acquaintances, or we just see general behavior and general observation, what we see in the world is that there are many today who are living unclean lives. Now again, the context here, we understand this was not a situation of her making, and that is sometimes the case for some people. They may find themselves in situations not of their choosing, but however, there are other circumstances when we think about sin coming into one's life that spiritually makes them unclean, just as this lady was physically unclean. And they live in that manner. They continue to suffer. And they, like this lady, they may seek healing, and like her, they may look to anywhere and to everywhere except where they should turn. Now the difference is, she turned to Jesus, as we are going to see, but yet there are many who still continue to remain in that state and do not seek Jesus. So secondly, when we continue in our study, we see her, in verse 27, approaching Jesus. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. Now, when we think about this particular statement, I want us to think about that, when she had heard about Jesus. Now, we see throughout the accounts here in Mark and also in Matthew and Luke as well, whenever Jesus worked a miracle, it was always in the presence of witnesses. So not only did those who were there saw it, but oftentimes what do we find recorded? That they went and they told others, and others were brought to him for healing and cleansing. So undoubtedly, she had heard from others, maybe friends or other acquaintances, but somehow she had heard about the one called Jesus. And in her desperation, she turned to him. Now, did she believe the things that she had heard about Jesus? We're not told. But if we think about it, she may have reached such a state that maybe, just maybe, she viewed it as she had nothing else to lose. Maybe going in without any or very little expectation of anything changing. But nonetheless, she turned to him in desperation. And a lot of times in our world today, that is oftentimes when people will begin to think about spiritual matters. It usually takes a crisis of some sort, sadly, for many to begin to think about these sorts of things. But she went based upon what she had heard, and she acted upon it in search of a cure and hoping for cleansing. And again, that today is the same thing that we need to do as well. We need to remember and we need to look to Jesus. And then we come to 28 and 29. For she said, if only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well. Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. So when we come to 28, we see that there was some belief in her. Now again, based upon what we find in verse 27, that she had heard about Jesus, again, having not actually seen any of these things for herself, maybe she wasn't fully convinced, but we do see some belief in her. But she went approaching that she could be cleansed, and she acted upon that belief. And here again is something that we need to reiterate often, is that belief or faith requires action on the part of someone, on the individual. And that is where so many get confused when it comes to spiritual matters and matters of faith, believing that belief requires no further action upon the part of the individual. But yet in each and every miracle of cleansing, we see this taking place. But because of her belief, we see that she was saved and she was cleansed from this malady. Notice verse 29 immediately. And as we've been studying for the last few weeks in our Monday morning class on Mark, the main or the key word when you read the book of Mark, at least from what I have found, is immediately. The word is found some 40-something times throughout the book. When it's there that many times, the author is trying to tell us something. And so we need to pay attention to those things. But we see that the cleansing was complete and whole. But we see from this, as taught elsewhere in the Scriptures, Romans chapter 10, for example, that faith comes by hearing. She had heard about Jesus. But not only did she hear about it, not only did she believe it, but she acted upon it. And that, again, is something that we cannot afford to miss. But we also see from this particular text, we see that the cleansing was complete and thorough. She felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. Now again, bringing that back to the present age. How many times have we had some sort of sickness or maybe some other sort of ailment, maybe a mild to moderate injury of some sort, or maybe a little bit of pain, or just not feeling well. And then finally, it comes to an end. And the relief that overtakes us when we're no longer suffering from that. We'll take something very simple and very basic, for example, sinus congestion. You just want to be able to breathe through your nostrils again. And then when that finally clears and you can breathe as you ought to be able to, how relieved are you? Because the body is back to its normal function. And so that's the idea here. Now again, I know that's very simple and very basic, but that's the idea that is being conveyed. And given the severity of her affliction, what I just said, of course, pales in comparison to what she had been suffering. But nonetheless, we will let that suffice. But I also want us to notice from this that there came a testing of faith. We come to verse 30, and Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" Jesus did not ask that question out of ignorance. He did not ask it out of doubt. He knew exactly what had happened. Now, when we back up just a little bit and we see that she touched his garment, the garment spoken of would have probably been a robe, and which was, of course, was very common dress for men of the era, and it probably would have had tassels or something, or fringes or something such as that, perhaps at the bottom. So the idea probably is that she would have probably kind of pulled at it a little bit. And you know that if you're walking especially, if someone or something, pulls, for example, your pant leg, you're going to feel that. And you're going to walk at a slower pace. That's probably what happened here. But he knew exactly what had happened, and he knew who had done it. The reason that he asked the question is he wanted her to make a proclamation of her faith. So when we come to verses 31 and 32, we find this: "But his disciples said to him, 'You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, Who touched me?' And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. Now, when you go and you look at Luke's account, for example, Luke chapter 8, Luke tells us that it was Peter who made this statement. And you say, who touched me? They, the disciples, were missing the point. As we see that happening several times throughout Jesus' ministry. And before we're too hard on them, sometimes we may miss things as well if we're not careful and if we don't give things the diligence that we need to. But this was a learning opportunity for them and for everyone else who witnessed this. He was seeking the one who sought him. Now, Hebrews 11 tells us that he is a rewarder of those who seek him diligently. And he knows who are his. He desires for us a confession of faith. He desires for us to see and to know the power that he possesses. The one who could heal and cleanse this lady of this malady that no one else was able is the same one who can cleanse our impurities today. And we, like this lady, must look to him. And then we see in verse 33, we see a confession of faith. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Now, I would imagine that this probably took some courage on the part of this lady. Now you think about again what her affliction was, and you think about the setting for this occasion, a public gathering, a very large crowd. But yet, she did not let the fear that she had consume her. She came and made a public confession. Just as she sought him in faith and confessed her faith in him, we too must make that same confession of faith. And how often is it that one who is sincerely seeking, like this lady, will also come with fear and trembling? But she also came in sincerity. I shall be made well. And then we come to the close of this particular account in verse 34. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. When he addresses her as daughter, this is an expression of consolation. He's consoling her. It is an expression of endearment, love, and I would dare say respect. Giving her assurance that there is no reason to fear. He spoke this to her In love, he demonstrated that she had been saved by faith. And then notice what he said, "Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." He pronounced her as clean. She left differently than she had when she arrived. And spiritually, that is how it should be in our lives. When we encounter Jesus, when we come to him in faith, and we make that confession of faith and we do what he has asked of us, we too can go away with that same assurance and that same confidence. We too can go in peace and know that we are healed. We need to approach him in confidence. We need to come in sincerity. And we need to come in confession of faith. And I encourage you to continue to read and to study these accounts, but I hope that the things that we've looked at here in our time together this morning, I hope that this will resonate with you. I hope it will encourage you, but if it need be, I hope it may challenge you in some way to search out the scriptures and to see what it is that you might need to do. And as always, we stand ready and willing to assist you as we have the opportunity in any and every possible way that we can. But if you are here this morning and you are like this woman, know that your suffering does not